O que você acha da cota para negros na universidade?
Olha, eu acho esse um assunto polêmico. A princípio, é uma medida que beneficia muita gente, mas eu particularmente sou contra. Eu sou contra porque eu acho que essa é uma medida muito paliativa, acho ela muito imediata, muito eleitoreira. Por quê? Porque você vai colocar no momento que você institui a cota, no momento imediatamente após, você consegue colocar um negro na universidade. Mas você não deu formação para esse negro, entendeu? Eu acho que seria mais interessante você ter boas escolas nas comunidades carentes, entendeu? Você ter bons professores, sabe, formando de fato aquelas pessoas para que elas realmente pudessem entrar na universidade com base, em condições, e não porque teve uma categoria meio café com leite. Não, sabe, eu quero que os negros entrem na universidade, mas na vaga dos brancos, entendeu? E não uma vaguinha, sabe, sei que e tal. Porque eu acho que isso, inclusive, pode, num futuro, criar um outro tipo de preconceito. Falar, pô, também ele está aqui, mas também com cota até eu, sabe? E essa cota é muito equivocada, porque, por exemplo, o meu filho, ele pode entrar pela cota de negros, e eu não acho isso justo, entendeu? O garoto estuda numa escola particular e tudo mais, mas ele bota lá que é negro e vai ter direito a uma coisa que um branco sem grana não vai ter direito. Não acho certo isso, entendeu?
Black History Month you find
ridiculous.
Why?
You're going to relegate my history to a month?
Oh, come on.
What do you do with yours? Which month is White History Month? No, come on, tell me.
Well, I'm Jewish.
Okay, which month is Jewish History Month?
There isn't one.
Oh, why not?
Yeah.
Do you want one?
No.
I don't either. I don't want a Black History Month. Black history is American history.
How are we going to get rid of racism?
Stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. I know you as Mike Wallace. You know me as Morgan Freeman.
It seems from your studies that in all those countries that adopted those programs of racial quotas, politicians used that. There was a lot of demagoguery involved. Why?
Well, it's always easy to say, particularly when it's some group that isn't performing as well as another group, to blame somebody else. People would much rather believe that their misfortunes are due to somebody else rather than to themselves. In many cases, their misfortunes may be due to historical factors over which they had no control. But the fact is that if they want to advance from where they are, they're going to have to acquire skills and do other kinds of things that are necessary. This is a distraction from that. This says to people, you don't have to measure up to what other people do. They owe it to you, and therefore you're to get this anyway. It's a double-edged thing, because not only do they usually not get very much out of it all, the slackening of their own efforts probably does them more harm than any benefits they're going to be given by the government.
The advocates of affirmative action claim that it has been one of the main factors for the creation of a black middle class in the U.S. Is that true?
No. The easiest way to look at that is that the black middle class existed before affirmative action existed. It has not grown faster under affirmative action. In fact, if you go back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the number of blacks rising into professional and other high-level occupations was greater in the 5 years prior to that legislation than in the 5 years following that legislation. So the black middle class grew primarily out of the black colleges where there was no affirmative action. And even to this day, in some of the scientific fields, the bulk of black PhDs came out of the black colleges, not out of the Harvards and Yales and other such places.
In Brazil, affirmative action is being introduced in universities. In the American universities, what has been the effect of affirmative action?
You've had a very high failure rate among the minority students brought in. And it's not because these students weren't qualified. At Berkeley, for example, during the era of affirmative action, over half the black students failed to graduate. Now, the average black student at Berkeley during that period scored higher than the average American student in the country at large. They were failing because they were at Berkeley, where you had the top, 10% of white students and the top 5% of Asian students. And so they were just simply overwhelmed. I mean, I saw this when it first came in Cornell, that there were many black kids there who would have sailed through and graduated with honors somewhere else. It's just that you can't make up in a few years for what you don't have otherwise. In my own classes, I gave a lot of reading assignments. Now, the average student at Cornell at that time had an SAT of 700, which meant they were fantastic readers. They could just go right through a book at high speed and know all of it. Very few people in the world can do that. Now, here, along comes a black student who's let in under affirmative action. He's a good student. He does well, but he can't do that, as most white students can't do that. But he's put into Cornell, and so we go whizzing along, and he's left behind. He doesn't learn things that he is perfectly capable of learning if it's taught at a normal pace.
But why wouldn't the black student be able to do that?
Oh, not as good a previous education. I mean, it's one thing if you've been through Andover or Exeter or any of these other high-priced schools and you've been taught all this. It's another thing if you come out of a ghetto school where the standards are much lower, and after 12 years of that, you can't make that up in a summer or in any other period of time that's going to get you through a high-powered school with the kind of results that there.
What is this phenomenon that happens in the U.S. among the black youth, where if you work hard, if you study hard, you're seen as acting white?
Yes, it's tragic. You didn't have that in my generation. That's a new thing, and it's part of the vision behind the whole civil rights affirmative action issue. The argument is, you see, that whites have their position solely because they're able to repress blacks. Now, if that's true, if it's true that no matter what you do, the white population is going to keep you from getting ahead, then it really makes no sense to knock yourself out. It makes no sense to study hard. And the people who do that are regarded as being dupes, if not traitors. And so, given what people have been saying, what so-called black leaders have been saying, the black students' responses are perfectly rational. It's just that what the leaders are saying is utter nonsense. Many of the leaders themselves are now appalled at the consequences, but the consequences follow logically from what they themselves have been saying.
Going back to your studies of several countries, you showed that even though those programs are not successful, they become entrenched. It's very difficult to get rid of them. Why?
Because they're successful for some people, and they're successful for those who are more fortunate, who are typically better educated, more organized. And it's always easier for a politician to say yes than to say no. I mean, once they're in place, if you take them away, there are people who never got a thing out of those things who will resent your taking them away. People who have never gained anything and have no prospect of gaining anything will nevertheless resent it. And so therefore you don't say no. And some other group comes along and they come up with a reason why they should get these very same preferences. And you say, yeah, sure, why not? And so you expand, ever expanding over time. These programs are put in often with the notion that they're temporary. They are never temporary. They not only persist, they expand.
Let's take your timeline. Nixon, the beginning of affirmative action. The progress made by blacks from the end of the Civil War until the Nixon administration in the 70s, and the progress made from the Nixon administration to today. Was the progress better, bigger, before affirmative action?
Well, there's a colleague of mine, Finus Welch, and he's done extensive work, research in here, and he points that the progress that black Americans made from 1940 to 1960 was greater than the progress that blacks made between 1960 and 1980. What was necessary was to get rid of the most abusive discriminatory laws. It was not discrimination. For example, blacks, at one time, blacks were not in basketball at all, professional basketball. Today, blacks are 80% of the players. They were not in football. Today, they're 60% of the players. And it was not affirmative action.
Now,
it was just being very, very good.
Now, see this. from the point of view of the argument, we're talking about physics ability that define a genetic progression. Well, genetic progression, it's a different progression than economic opportunity progression, intellectual progression. So when you talk about the fact that without affirmative action, blacks have done very well in some fields like basketball, isn't that a little different from doing well in a field?
If you look at the question, you say, look, you add up the amount of earnings that black Americans earn each year, and it's very significant. We'll be the 14th or 15th richest nation in the world if you just thought of us as a nation. That is a tremendous gain, and I doubt whether you can attribute it to affirmative action.
You would eliminate it today, quotas and all?
Yes, I would, because I think that there's, well, number one, I think that quotas themselves are unfair. But number two, they don't act in the favor of the people who are so-called beneficiaries of quotas. That is, for example, many colleges have quotas, and so what they do, like Harvard and Yale and MIT, they recruit black people to their school, black students, and these are high-powered schools, and many times the black students flunk out because they cannot compete. And if they came to some other school that was not as high-powered, they would get through. And so a lot of times affirmative action works against the people who are said to be beneficiaries of it.
If I don't have a school when I'm a kid, if I don't have a high school later on, or a college to go to, how could I compete? Isn't that fair that I have some? I mean,
well, if you look at just, I'm not telling everybody look at my life, but if you look at my life, I grew up. I was born in the middle of the Depression, the Great Depression of the country, gross discrimination, and the way that I was able to compete with my colleagues is that, let's say when I went to UCLA, I got my doctorate at UCLA, and UCLA was ranked number 10 in terms of quality of schools in the country. What it meant is that because my education wasn't as good as the other guys there, it meant that I had to work harder. That is, I had to study longer. But I didn't get any special favors. I just studied, like maybe a guy who had a rich family, who went to middle-class schools, maybe he got his assignment done in an hour. And maybe it took me 5 hours to do the same assignment. But the bottom line was, it was done.
In Brazil, black origins are a majority in the population. They don't get any breaks. Do you think that this is the way it's supposed to be?
Well, I think that instead of breaks, I say that what people need is opportunities. That is, for example, there are many laws and regulations, and I don't know all of them in Brazil, but there are many laws and regulations that cut off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. Just for one example, in New York City, in order to get a license to own and operate one taxi, in May 2007, such a license sold for $600,000.
Yeah.
And so you say, what is the effect of a law that creates such a license? It cuts off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. It stops anyone who does not have that kind of money or bank finance of getting into the cab business. Minimum wage laws, Davis-Bacon, like in the United States, laws that set minimum wages, it discriminates against low-skilled people getting a hold onto the economic ladder. So what I propose for people, not only in the United States, but around the world, is that we have a free enterprise system, voluntary, peaceable exchange.
And you don't think that anybody would argue or counter-argue that affirmative action helped that?
If affirmative action did not help that. Affirmative action did not. That is, if you say, again, you're going back to the statistics, you do a before and after on affirmative action, you see the progress and the gains that blacks made were greater before affirmative action than after.